People like games.
What's up, everybody? I'd like to welcome back a very special guest, his third time official friendo of the show, Joost Van Dreunen, Professor of NYU, author of One Up, which I actually happen to have here, and the co-host of the podcast Unboxing. Check him out. Everything's great. We've been having a long convo, but because we have a little bit of a hard stop, we're going to jump right into convo. So, last year we talked. We have once a year conversations going at the moment. And I asked you what your favorite game was of that past year. Last time you said Halo. I imagine that has not held up. So what has been your favorite game of the past year?
It's a Plague Tale Requiem. That's really where my heart is now. Like it's not a super great game in that it's like sort of straightforward. Like it doesn't innovate on a lot of things. You know, the gameplay with like the way that you're sort of stealthily trying to survive as opposed to Assassin's Creed where you just stab people. But there's something about the atmosphere in that game I just find intoxicating. I'm somehow like living in this like post-metaverse universe. Going back to the 12th century France is just a fantastic experience.
That's funny. It reminds me a little bit of what Dishonored, where I have that similar sort of background setup. But no God of War, no Elden Ring. You avoided the 1-2.
I played Elden Ring. I played that for a bit. You know, I have little children, so like Elden Ring is just like, look, I have two of those in my house.
I have enough frustrations
that are tough enough to beat. So those are good, but then I felt like a lot with Gears of War. That's been kind of fun, but kind of interesting to see how they push the franchise. It's weird how they do it, but it's worthwhile. And I have my staples. Like I fell into Snap, of course. I like Rocket League still. You know, that never changes. These like Mitch Lasky will say they're forever games. It's like, yeah, you know, like you have a handful of them that you play for years.
Of course. So, and it's funny, out of all the esports that were being created around that time, Rocket League is the one just going strong. That's a forever sport in there. But then what is the best book you've read in the last year?
So I'm still working on it.
Delusion.
But this one is a Digital Playgrounds. It came out by Grimes. So it's super academic. Like it's, you know, let's see, it'll give you a feel of what that sounds like. You know, the main theme is the commercialization and how promotional discourses can shape a game's design, content, and even player behavior. So it's just like media theory and communication theory, and you know, basically about early childhood and how do designers and sort of the for-profit industry around games shape online worlds, which is not unrelated to the second book I'm writing myself, but it's very pedagogically inclined and it really focuses on children alone. And it's fascinating to read through that. So I like that a lot because it's not very data driven. It's not like, oh, here's how big everything is. But it, as they say in academia, it problematizes a lot of the questions around like, okay, if kids are spending all their time in Roblox, like, okay, what's going on in there, right? And how does that relate? Like, so all of their behavior is monitored, right? So there's one example in England where there's a school that was very happy to congratulate itself on the fact that they had eliminated bullying from the playgrounds, from the schoolyards, by basically canceling recess outside. And you're like, okay, so you're literally throwing the children out with the bathwater, where you just like no longer allow people to have, you know, unstructured, unsupervised playtime. And of course, there's no bullying because they're sitting in the cafeteria for an hour, you know, bored out of their mind. So when do large corporations start imposing their needs and interests on like kids' play spaces, especially the ones online? I find it fascinating, especially as a dad. I find that to be curious.
Absolutely. That's actually similar to a book I'm reading right now. It's called Irresistible, and it's by Adam Adler, and it's about basically online addiction and behavioral addiction, and basically how games are sort of designed to a degree with certain types of loops to create that, especially when they're focused for children. But when it comes to a bit of regulation on gaming, that brings us now to our next question, which is one I'm sure you've actually spoken a bunch about and written a bunch about, but one we talked about last year, which is obviously Microsoft's acquisition of Activison-Blizzard. And when we spoke, I said, was there a chance that they were going to try to do something with antitrust related? And at the time, no one really thought so. And now a year later, Microsoft's, I guess, acquisition looks a little bit more up in the air than it has prior. What happened over the course of the year? What sort of changed? What was the pivot point that it went from, all right, that's cool, to, oh, wait a second, I don't think we want this to happen?
That's a good question. So there's different ways to look at it. I mean, the easiest one is to say it's just a big transaction, right? And so Microsoft has acquired things like Minecraft back in the day for like $2.5 billion. They acquired LinkedIn for $14.7 billion. ZeniMax Media is $7.5 billion. You know, look, give me $1 billion, you'll never hear from me again. Like, that's plenty of money.
Yeah.
But 70 billion is, even for Microsoft, like just a fantastic amount of money. So that just attracts a lot of eyeballs, right? And so then you get scrutinized differently. The idea that you would have, this is not a component to it, like the Federal Trade Committee, the FTC, has just gotten a new administration. They have a new leadership team in the last 2 years. Lena Khan and Tim Wu, we recently left, but they've been driving a very different political agenda. Basically saying a lot of these platform companies, including Microsoft, they are creating unfair advantages for themselves in all these different markets. We need to regulate that, not more, but in a more precise way, so to speak. And it ends up basically, if that's your theme, if that's the message you're starting with, and then on your watch, Microsoft is spending 70 billion on some publisher, you can't not say anything. You must, but otherwise you're not doing your job. So for those reasons, I think, just the size, the scrutiny, the sort of moment around large companies, all of that, I think, feeds into, the motivation for some of these companies to push the antitrust button and say, let's go scrutinize this and see what's really there.
A little bit of like the wrong time, wrong place for the acquisition, because the Xbox One was pretty big itself, and it did bring up the argument once they were like, oh hey, now it's a Xbox exclusive of subsequent. They sort of set off the arms race in gaming, right? Or the Bungie, and now for them to suddenly say, and I was listening to your podcast, and you mentioned yourself that they're saying, oh hey, well, of course we'll put Call of Duty on the Switch, and it's sort of like, of course NVIDIA GeForce will do it. Is it a little bit disingenuous? Are they looking at comparative or the previous purchase in that decision to be like, I don't know if Microsoft has a history of this exact thing? Does all that play into it, just from your analysis, or is it sort of more isolated?
That's a really good question, and I think it's a fair question. Like, they did do that thing where they made some promises and then they did not necessarily follow through on that, and so you kind of have to wonder, like, okay, was that the right move? And did you jeopardize the $70 billion deal with the way that in the wake of the $7.5 billion ZeniMax deal?
A little bit.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, if we're going for pass fail, they're like, yeah, you totally did. And so it's a, so that makes life a little harder for them. But, I don't think so. So here's the thing. So Microsoft, and you're going back 20 years now, but so Microsoft has been put over a barrel for a long time with this bundling of its operating software and application software, right? So it had Internet Explorer as a standard feature, and it's like operating software, and people didn't like that because it was unfair competition, blah blah blah, and of course it was. But then you have this whole fallout in terms of, can you unbundle that somehow, and how would you divest some of these components for a company as large as Microsoft? So they eventually ended up just paying a fee, simply put, but it ends up, but so they became also somewhat inoculated. They knew what not to do anymore, right? They were just sort of nailed against the wall as an example of like what not to do. Yeah. And for 20 years, they've been writing that. And so they come at this not as some company that's doing this for the first time, right? I think that Microsoft is very capable of pushing this deal through just the same. Yeah. But it's true that maybe they've created some inefficiencies for themselves along the way.
Yeah. And so then, one of the arguments, because I wanted to touch on Sony too, because you've been writing a lot about that, which is their comparison to Sony has exclusives as well. Now Sony has been really utilizing that exclusives that they've built up, Last of Us, God of War, etc., to start shifting into more television and more prestige, because they've been the prestige game maker where you would get that sort of cinematic experience. But over the course of the year, we talked about them not trying to acquire Activison-Blizzard because they don't have the digital infrastructure, so they didn't need to try to make it a cloud competition. but now they've sort of put their sort of hands everywhere in digital media to sort of become a bit more of a media services company. Now, do you think that this pivot was in response to Microsoft trying to acquire Activision-Blizzard, or do you think this was something that was running? Because Microsoft's shift to cloud and that sort of structure didn't happen overnight either. So for a while, it looked like PlayStation didn't have a response because they didn't have cloud, but they've been sort of good about their own PlayStation Pass of being like, no, we'll sell our exclusives because there's no reason to put everything on our PlayStation Plus Game Pass or whatever it is. Right. Yeah, is that pivot in response to what Microsoft has been doing?
Short answer, yes. Microsoft, of course, is just one company in a larger market. Like you see, up until very recently, Google was coming after that market too with Stadia. Google is not some small company, right? Amazon with Luna is like, well, are they going to be the leading firm? No. Will they take market share away from Sony? Probably a little bit, yeah. If nothing else, like publishers will have a broader range of options and can negotiate across multiple channels. So, it's better if you're the biggest one of two. It's cool. It's that's better than being the biggest one of four.
Yeah,
you just have to you have to spread it a little thinner. So I think Sony saw the writing on the wall. Sony has also been transitioning away from relying exclusively on hardware and consumer electronics for a long time. Like Apple, they've been moving away from just devices and sort of hardware manufacturing because it's a very cumbersome process. We saw during the pandemic, all these supply chain issues, microchips are incredibly expensive. The development of microchips is incredibly costly. Long-term investment is just like a huge gamble. So, that's a good business historically, but like unless you have a Walkman on your hands, it's going to be, you're just another device maker, right? It's hard to differentiate at some point. And what's been working out for these type of companies is selling recurrent revenue models based around content. And I think that's where Sony got wiser and said like, we should really leverage our first party proprietary content to push our PlayStation Plus subscriptions and so on.
Yeah.
So I think it's a reaction to Microsoft, to answer your question, and the market in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I think their smartest buy was probably Crunchyroll because the anime market is voracious consumers, and especially in America, it's fast growing. I actually ended up interviewing an author last week, a really good guy about anime and its growth here. Now it's sort of a long running thing. But
do you watch any anime?
I do. If you see here, I got One Piece. That's sort of like my one. I watched a lot of anime growing up, and so I like those mid 2000s versions of shows like Trigun and Yu Yu Hakusho and it's sort of original stuff. But then now it's a bit different for me now. I see it, but it's a bit, I don't know. The graphics are too good. Is that a weird thing to say? Like it doesn't hit that same...
it's very clean nowadays, huh?
We grew up on like hand-drawn 2D, proper animation and illustration. And so when I see this, I'm like, it's beautiful, it's on fine, but it doesn't hit the same itch that I have for a hand-drawn sort of old Dragon Ball Z cartoon.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's I enjoy contemporary anime very much. It's beautiful. It's like the production values have gone up. At the same time, it used to be a little bit more off the beaten path. It felt like I was downloading something that you couldn't get anywhere, and that's totally gone. It's on Netflix now, which I enjoy those shows. I just finished Bastard, and now I've been my favorite one. I think it was on Netflix back in the day. It was Elfen Lied. It was just brutal hack and slash anime. It was wonderful. It's very much enjoyed that. And my all-time favorite was, of course, Berserk.
Yeah,
both the manga and it's like
the brutal king.
Oh my god! It's just like, and you're sitting there watching, like, oh, this is an adult animation.
It makes sense why you like Gears of War. One to one.
It all, like I'm a very nice person otherwise, but I guess my well-adjustment in life comes from having like these like. Pressure valves.
I was gonna say
anime is one of them.
It really is, and so like its growth here as a cultural phenomenon has been interesting, and so the author's name is Matt Alt, and it's just basically how Japan has become this exporter of culture, and how that became dominant elsewhere. And so it was super interesting, and so it's funny to see because all the kids I grew up with, anime was weird and sort of an odd subculture, and all those niche cultures have sort of blown up, gaming included. But as an identity, I am not an anime consumer. As a fan, of course, same thing with gaming. But which, funny enough, because we were talking about Sony using their games to make television shows and movies, etc., there is another company that I feel has been very undervalued, and that's Nintendo, oddly enough. And all of the more so financial analysts reading, they keep mentioning Nintendo's hardware numbers are down for the Switch, and they're waiting for a successor. How come everyone is failing to realize that, like, Nintendo World just opened in California and will be opening in Florida, and the Mario movie is coming out in the beginning of the IP? Like, Nintendo is the new Disney. Why is it sort of a disconnect with people, or understanding that, I guess, on an average? You see it.
That's been the case for like years.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think it has to do with a few different factors. Like, one of them is a Japanese company, right? It's like they just don't get the same love and respect among Western investors. Same thing you could say for Konami, Square Enix, Capcom, all those companies, you know, because they're just so far away. I mean, you could in fact draw that line. Like, most of the major Asian game companies are sort of second tier to like Activision and fucking Ubisoft of all. You know, it's just like ridiculous.
Literally.
So I think that just has to do with sort of like a you know, an emphasis on like the North American market and what they are capable of knowing. You know, I would walk into you know, I regularly walk into these boardrooms and have meetings with, you know, people managing funds, and they're all nice people, but they're all sort of from that same mindset of being, you know, they have a finance background, so they all understand NFL Madden. They all get FIFA. They get the model, they get EA, they understand how EA talks and walks. And then you look at Nintendo, it's like, why does that make sense? And it doesn't to them. And I think that's part of the fact that that's part of the reason why they get a lower valuation overall. And I think you're right that it's undeserved. That it's worth a lot more than it is.
I think people will sort of realize that once the Mario movie comes out, and because if it's from the same creators of Despicable Me, you know, it's going to be addictive for kids in particular, which are going to be more familiar with it than Mickey Mouse. But
they're going to be, you know, my kid was playing like Super Smash right at the same time Minion Rush came out, but like the comparison between those two, this is like night and day, right?
And then I see every one of those characters in Super Smash, and I'm like, oh my god, you can make a movie with every single one of these characters. You have infinite IP, and we're in an IP world. Should bring back why FTC didn't try to stop Disney's acquisition of Star Wars and Marvel in 20th century, but shout out Ajit Pai. Now, moving on to esports. So, you know, obviously over our 3 years of talking that I was not a fan of the esports business model. And actually we were talking about FaZe going public. That ended poorly. And the whole industry is sort of ending poorly at the moment. But realistically, you know, now that it sort of crumbled based on what we had mentioned, which were sort of limited avenues of monetization versus the VC money going in. So there was no real space for the ROI. They weren't tech. They weren't really creating anything inherently of value. They were sort of a lifestyle company. All of these places were lifestyle companies. So now that bubble has burst, in that version, at least, of the Overwatch League's to blame for this overvaluation, what do you see as the sort of corrective steps moving forward? Do you have any idea what that might look like?
Corrective steps to the business model of esports?
I would say for the organizations, you know, now that they were given this amount of money and that model that they were invested in hasn't worked, right? Is there just going to continue now that all of these layoffs have happened? Or are we just like, oh man, that was tough, time to just keep doing the same thing, right? I don't think so. I think there has to be like where did this model go wrong? I point to Overwatch League and just the cost of the buy-ins, where that just created a weird overvaluation.
So, I mean, here's the thing with esports, right? So from the top, my realization was always, or whatever, what always bugged me about the whole thing was that on the one hand, people couldn't shut up about esports. On the other hand, it's worth like 6 cents relative to the rest of the games industry, right? And so there's like, why aren't more people talking about, I don't know, conventional console gaming? Like esports, even by the most naive high-end estimations, it would be like $1 billion a year, which it isn't. But let's say it's $1 billion a year. That makes it 0.5% in a $200 billion business. Come on, like that. Like that's not a disproportionate. Like, so it's a very disproportionate amount of attention around this one tiny fraction, and it's really mostly marketing for free-to-play titles, like League of Legends, sure, and all these other sort of titles in the same category. They benefit from this. But do you make money doing this? Absolutely not. And the idea that you could push forward a bunch of content with a lot of eyeballs, sell a bunch of games, and sell a bunch of sponsorships, I like that very much, of course. And there's lots of, high-end consulting firms that would recommend that you do so. But in the end, where it breaks down in my mind is that you don't have critical mass. The publishers own the game, so they can do whatever they want. It's not like soccer or football or whatever, where it's like the games, I think those games are also owned, of course, but they don't compete head to head with each other. Like football and soccer, American football and European soccer, let's say, they are similar maybe, but but they don't compete at all for audience in that sense. And so, but Counter-Strike and Overwatch, it's a different audience, right? It's a weird mix of different owners of different adjacent types of similar titles.
Yeah.
And then you move into sort of really a conventional sports licensing model where you say, well, we're going to sell, you have to buy in as a team, and then you'll get a piece of the pie. But we're not going to prove that out at all, because the next problem, and I noticed from my time at Nielsen, was simply put, like conventional brands, they looked at it as like a novelty, but they didn't believe it at all. And the reason they didn't believe it was because they were just hard to convince. And also there was this vacuum of data. There was just no provable data-driven model. So you're making a lot out of very little. Eventually that's going to come to pass, right?
Exactly. And I think that's really what happened in that model. So that's why I was curious to be like, all these orgs that sort of built their large valuations based upon, hey, we're going to join all these leagues and those leagues aren't paying out, etc. What the future is seems to be trying to leverage that into like consumer products like 100 Thieves is, or go into game development like creators have been like Donkey or Dr. Disrespect, etc. But then now I have 2 more questions, but I'm going to start with this one first. Hogwarts Legacy. So I know you had the full conversation on your show, Unboxing Pod, which is available everywhere. But now I want to ask, does the success of it, in your opinion, reflect anything other than a well-timed release at the end of a quiet year during a quiet season? Like there's an outsized level of conversation and sales, but as someone who grew up as a Harry Potter fan, I actually have like the book series sitting right there on my shelf. I didn't buy, I know the conversation, I'm aware of all of it, but like I didn't know there was that many fans of gaming and Harry Potter. It never really meshed to me. So seeing these sales, do you attribute it to, because I know you mentioned on the show, you're like, hey, do you think the controversy increased sales? Do you think that it was bound to have this level of sales regardless of that sort of controversy? Were you surprised to see it become such a bellwether for a cultural conversation like that when it's just
I was not surprised. And the thing is, so there's a few pieces to it, but I guess the short version of it is Harry Potter sold more than 600 million book copies, like the book series. There's a shit ton of books.
Yeah,
so
books.
To sell like 10, 12 million copies of games, like that's nothing. Like I'm sure that some fraction of all those book readers has a PlayStation or some other device to play this game on. So it's, I'm sure there's a lot of Steam players that are also avid readers of this. You're probably included in that mix. So so the numbers totally make sense to me, which is also why the franchise itself is like, that's a total evergreen play. Like, it's the sort of textbook case where you say, I take existing IP, we're going to build a game, we're going to do a good job on the game, and it's going to totally work. And it did. And now they're all happy, and it's the biggest thing for Warner Brothers and Avalanche ever. So everybody's happy. The controversy part, in the end, I have to kind of conclude that, like, despite all this uproar on Twitter, it's like 12 million copies. That tells you that the amount of people, or the extent that people care, is absolutely zero. Like they just want to play the game, right? And I don't mean it as an accusation. I just purely say, perhaps, and this is where my co-host and I disagreed a little bit, but I would say that the controversy probably sold more copies. It's not provable. I don't know this, but I'm guessing, and it ends up being, on the headlines constantly. It's on TV. All of a sudden Harry Potter, the game, gets a lot of like TV airtime, and it just pushes people to the store. So I think that did not have a negative impact. I think some people boycotted it, but I think more people bought it as a result of this controversy. And then there is the whole, almost billionaire white woman being victimized somehow, but in fact, she's got nothing nice to say to anybody else. So it's just kind of like a weird story of games and like, anti-trans commentary. It's just like, okay. So
it's
that makes for a very,
drama.
it's ideal for headlines. So, but it doesn't take away from the game itself. I think the game is beautiful. People did a really good job developing it. Like, they should be proud of their effort, but that's what it is. And so at the end of the day, I had a conversation with Forbes as I tried to figure out, how much money they should make, and it's meaningless. So, if the boycott was, we have to stop buying this game so that J.K. Rowling doesn't get more money. It's like, well, she really got nothing.
Yeah.
Not really.
And I know they've made a lot of efforts to sort of spin off the Harry Potter IP and corresponding world into like the wizarding world is what they call it, instead of Harry Potter, because you're like, we're not Harry Potter, we're the wizarding world, but it's just like taking all the IP, but just sort of like scrubbing that story out, which is what a little bit of the game felt like. And I was fine with it because I was curious if Harry Potter as an IP had that strength the same way they are doing with Star Wars to create these side story concepts. And I'm like, because I've always thought, would they remake the Harry Potter movies? Like, or is it one of those rare movies? It's not like Spider-Man, Batman, like they just redo it every time. They've invested so much money and it's so like special. You can only do sequels like Star Wars, where you can't do anything at all in side stories. So
it's the Harryverse or the Harrylorian, so the spin-off side quests.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like the idea. I mean, it's a bit like EA Sports FC, right?
Yeah.
Like if you let go of the core franchise, can you develop a game in the category that's still equally appealing to players?
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Well, I would start with a better name than EAFC, but regardless,
you and me both. I don't know, like what mediocre management came up with that one.
That's like when MLS was starting to get club team names, and they're like, what do they do over there in Europe? Try it. I was like, it's so weird over here, man. New York City. I was like, no, it's not like Manchester. It's not how that works.
Like a little, like we're naming billion-dollar franchises here. Can we just have a few more options in the hat? Like, come on.
Open up the brainstorming session, guys. Maybe the second agency might have a better idea. But
exactly, spend the money.
Joke aside, now to the last question, which you touched on a little bit actually at the end, but is one that I really want to talk to you about. The state of gaming media. So there obviously has been a huge growth in gaming. It continually grows at pace. Esports aside, just the idea of the industry, the amount of people who are interested, the average player type, et cetera, all of those have expanded like rapidly, and they're going to continue to expand and grow. But games media is shrinking sort of rapidly, and there's a big argument that there's no financial, plausibility or viability in the games media space, right? Launcher and fan bite and yada yada. Every place that I was surprised, given that they have valuable ownership in that sense. What in your opinion, in your analysis, what is causing that sort of contradictory shrinking comparative to the growth of the industry?
So why do video games media seem to suffer when the rest of the industry is just thriving? I hope that it's a reshuffling, right? I think that the type of, it used to be mostly trade press, where you have like these embedded people that spend all their time playing, and they were deep fans of video games, and then they would also become reviewers, right? Anywhere from IGN or Polygon, these people, that's what they do for a living all day, every day. I think then for it to go mainstream, you need to have some kind of presence. And I guess the part of the conversation I had with Lane too is well, initially it's all about the industry, because that's sort of part of the adult world that we can make sense of, right? It's like I don't know if you ever read the Petit Prince and Little Prince, in which he makes this argument, this little kid basically saying like, grown-ups only ever want to hear numbers, right? They don't, when you say I made a friend, it's not about like what's his favorite color or what kind of cupcakes does he like. It's how big is their house, how much money does his dad make, and it's sort of this quantification of social life. I think a lot of newspapers have been spending a lot of time looking at the numbers behind this. I think some of them are a little better, like Jason Schreier, Bloomberg. He focuses on the unionization bit, and it's a little bit of the softer, gooier stuff in the industry. So not necessarily about the numbers. It's still Bloomberg, of course. It's very economy-driven stuff, and I think that is the only reasonable sub-narrative that gaming can live in right now. You see in some newspapers, like the Financial Times, they have more of a culture section. The Wall Street Journal had that a long time ago, where you could see gaming through a lens of its cultural relevance. But by and large, they've shied away from it in the same way that, like, book reviewers and sort of the literature, like every newspaper, every magazine will have like an annual review of the best 20 books. And why don't they have that for video games? They do it with movies, they do it with records, with concerts, with albums. So, and that holdup, I think, is part of the problem, is that there's force, but I think it's also everybody's still a little hesitant to report against it. Plus, the trade press for gaming is very well versed. Like, what would you contribute as the New York Times in addition? So it's they do a reasonable job across the board. In some cases, it's a swing and a miss for these mainstream outlets, but they at least try in some cases, and I commend them for that. But how much further can they take it than like this deep specialization you see everywhere? So it's a little too bad. Like, do I want it to have more visibility? Of course, but it gets a lot of love already, right?
Do you see anything like you're familiar with The Athletic? The online, it's sort of like online sports journalism. It's a website, but they're paywalled. They do articles and analysis, sort of like ESPN, but I think they were bought by New York Times for like a bill, maybe a year or two ago. I forget, but like a version of that, of a paywall oriented gaming media. Or do you think that the version now, like you're saying, which is you can't compete with them, but even the other spheres, like game reviews are already going to be competed with by streamers. So like that general lifestyle streamer that some person loves on YouTube, they'll watch them because they're already in line with their gaming interests. So why would you go to, whoever, Roger Ebert is for gaming? Why am I going to read his opinion when my favorite streamer told me that this game sucks, right? There's no creative merits being argued. There's no narrative, constructive, qualitative arguments. It's just, I like it or I don't. And I just want someone I already like to tell me whether they like it or don't.
Yeah, it's true. So I think the model, I'm just looking over this website now. I think that model could work, but there's so much out there for games. And it's a little bit like, so most of the reason why people will follow a game is because they are curious to hear if this new release is going to be worth their while, and or they want to know how well it did or what the story is behind the specific title. So it's very focused on like small components, like the larger narrative, like the way that in, like, say, the tech industry, it's all about, and the tech industry gets a disproportionate amount of media attention. It's a very small component of the economy, relatively speaking, to like everything else. However, it gets a huge amount of media attention, and it's because it's a bellwether for the economy. It's considered, this high growth area. There's a lot of drama, all these like, Elon Musk characters running around making decisions for everybody else. So in other words, like that one has a lot of internal stuff going on, whereas the games industry does not, right? The music industry kind of does, which is also much smaller. So I think you need to offer a little bit more than just like, there's a great new release. And I don't see a lot of writing in that. Like, where's the grandeur? Like, what's the equivalent of the data privacy issues that the tech industry suffered? Right.
Bring antagonism back to journalism, gamers.
A
little bit. Like, I mean,
where are the profiles of all these CEOs? Like, other than like Bobby Kotick has been getting, hosed in the media, of course, for a lot of stuff, which you could argue is justified. But it's there's very little going on about that, but you could easily find that kind of stuff.
But it's always it's a little bit more access journalism in gaming, I guess, but that separates it into a separate side in question. But because we are on time limit, I'm going to give one more question before I let you go and enjoy your afternoon. I think it's Tuesday afternoon. What is one prediction you have for 2023 in gaming?
Oh, in gaming. There's a few. I wrote up a piece, this is in January, to kind of look at it. let's do a spicy one. I mean, obviously, there's like the AI stuff, and it's an interesting question. It's kind of top of mind. So I'm doing a talk at South by Southwest next week, and it's part of that. So it's sort of sitting and looking at it. So AI is obviously one because nobody can shut up about it. Everybody has to talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's cool, and it's totally going to be transformative in some meaningful way. But we'll see. It's going to take a little while. Like it doesn't go that far, but it's sort of an obvious one. One specific to the game industry that's not as spicy is unionization. I think it's a big transformative moment for the industry, but that's been long coming. Like that's not really a prediction. Like that's been in the works, and now that the games industry is as big as it is, it should really do more than what it does. You already mentioned esports. My guess, to take a spicy one, is that there's going to be a incumbent media or entertainment conglomerate that's going to double down on crypto or some kind of Web3 initiative, and it's going to bring a lot more validation to the space. And I think it's going to be like a Disney that's going to get into it, right? So one version of that, or a slightly different version, is that it's Disney buying Roblox. I don't know. I'm not sure that Disney is entirely comfortable with that, but it's going to be something along those lines where an emerging technology that is totally still broken and nascent in many ways is going to prove to be something of use. And it's going to be part of a transformative cycle for a huge conglomerate right now, right? And so you see it on the fringes, like Square Enix and Ubisoft kind of tinkering around. Nobody really is asking for that. So there's a lot of pushback, but I think the large conglomerates are becoming a little different. And the reason I say it is because Disney, as I'm sure you'll know, it got out of gaming after a long time. Because Bob Iger, the long-standing CEO and now returning CEO after he kicked out the other guy, he was never big on gaming and ultimately decided that because Disney sucked in games, they just needed to get the hell out of it. Like, Disney Infinite it just wasn't a success. So they just let it be and walked away and just licensed their content. So you see plenty of Star Wars games, so it's just them making a buck. They're not actually developing it.
Yeah.
The reason Disney might be jumping into crypto is because, Bob Iger has also said, like, digital collectibles that may not make sense for any of us here in this room, meaning some generation of executives, but that doesn't mean it's not meaningful to other people. And if you combine that notion with, say, digital and real life events sort of hand in hand, you go to the theme parks and you get like a collectible, and now you can unlock something in some other application. I think we're not too far away from that. And then it's just a question of, do you build it yourself? Which Disney is not going to do because it's all about IP. It's going to have to be something that they acquire. So that's why Disney's going to get into crypto or something along those lines.
I feel like someone needs to work on the display end of that, because I feel like if you have a bunch of digital collectibles, you want like a digital frame case to like display it. So interesting. Disney getting crypto. I was going to say Activison-Blizzard and Microsoft acquisition. Does it go through? Yes or no?
It goes through. Absolutely.
It goes through. Interesting. All right. Well, next year we're going to find out once we come back around and have a conversation. And yeah, that's all I had. Joost, thank you very much as always for coming on the show.
Pleasure to have you.
Time. And all right, man. I'll be in touch soon.
Good luck, man. Take it easy.
Thank you very much.
Bye.